The air in JFK's Terminal 4 tasted of recycled plastic and stale coffee, a bitter cocktail for a bitter duty. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood ramrod straight, the polished gleam of his army dress blues, a stark contrast to the chaotic sea of travelers. The uniform, heavy with ribbons and medals that felt like anchors pulling him down, was his armor. But today, it felt paper-thin against the grief that gnawed at him from the inside. Outside, on the rain-slicked tarmac, was a flag-draped transfer case. Inside was Private First Class Liam Miller. 22 years old, a kid with a blindingly bright future, a mind like a steel trap, and a laugh that could cut through the thickest tension. Gone. "Bring my boy home, Marcus," Liam's mother had pleaded, her voice shattered over a satellite phone connection that crackled with static and sorrow. "Please, just bring him home." "I will, Carol," he had promised. "I give you my word." That promise was now the only mission that mattered. The official report was a sterile, insultingly simple piece of fiction. Killed in action during a disorganized enemy ambush. Thorne knew better. He had been there. The ambush wasn't disorganized. It was a surgical, brutally efficient execution. They knew exactly where to hit, exactly when. It was a setup. And Liam, the unit's brilliant data analyst, had been the primary target. Thorne was certain of it. The kid had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. He approached the Global Wings priority check-in counter, his dress shoes clicking a somber rhythm on the linoleum. He placed his military orders and ID on the counter. The agent, a young woman whose name tag read Sandra, offered a practiced, weary smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good afternoon, sir. Where are you flying today?" she asked, her voice automated. "Phoenix. I'm a military escort," Thorne said, his voice low and even. He tapped a gloved finger on the official DoD documents. "I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier, PFC Liam Miller." The smile on Sandra's face didn't just falter. It evaporated. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she quickly looked down at her screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She began to type, but her movements were jerky, uncertain. A flicker of something fear, panic, crossed her face. She swallowed hard, her gaze darting from her screen to the documents and back again. Thorne's internal alarm, honed by 2 decades in special operations, began to hum. This wasn't the usual fumbling of a new employee. This was something else. "Is there a problem?" he asked, keeping his tone level. "One moment, sir," she mumbled, refusing to meet his eyes. She typed furiously, then stopped, her shoulders tensing. She leaned over to her coworker and whispered something Thorne couldn't hear. The other agent glanced at him, her expression a blank mask, before shaking her head and turning back to her own customer. Sandra turned back to her terminal, her knuckles white as she gripped her mouse. The line behind Thorne was growing, the impatient sighs of business travelers and the whines of tired children filling the air. Thorne didn't move. He stood like a statue, his focus entirely on the woman behind the counter. Finally, she looked up. A new, painfully forced smile plastered on her face. "I'm very sorry, Colonel, but there appears to be an issue with the cargo manifest. We can't authorize your boarding at this time." Thorne felt a cold spike of anger, but he forced it down, burying it under layers of discipline. "There is no issue," he stated, not asked. "The military has coordinated this transport for weeks. My orders are clear. The manifest is pre-approved by the TSA and your own airline. Check again." "I understand, sir, but it's an internal security policy," she stammered, her eyes pleading with him to just accept it. "There's nothing I can do." "Policy?" Thorne's voice dropped, gaining an edge of steel. "What policy prevents a soldier from bringing his brother home?" The quiet intensity of his question silenced the immediate area. A few people in line lowered their phones, their interest peaked. Sandra looked like a cornered animal. I need to get my supervisor." She practically fled from the counter, disappearing through a door marked Authorized Personnel Only. Thorne remained at the counter, his gaze fixed on the door she had vanished through. His promise to Carol Miller echoed in his mind. He wasn't just escorting a fallen soldier. He was a guardian, and he was failing. The feeling was a venom in his veins. He subtly scanned the terminal. His training took over, his senses expanding, cataloging the environment, tourists with cameras, a janitor pushing a cart, a man in a suit talking animatedly on his phone. Nothing seemed out of place, yet everything felt wrong. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Sandra emerged, followed by a man in a crisp, slightly too tight suit. His name tag read, Garrett Vance, Terminal Supervisor. He had the slick, overconfident air of a man who enjoyed his small kingdom of rules and regulations. Colonel Thorne, Vance began, his voice smooth and condescending. I'm Garrett Vance. I understand there's some confusion. There's no confusion, Mr. Vance, Thorne replied, his eyes locking onto the supervisor's. There's a refusal to honor a military transport order. I need you to fix it, now. Vance's smile was a thin, unpleasant line. He glanced at the papers, barely skimming them. As my associate explained, we have certain policies in place for sensitive cargo. It's a matter of internal protocol. Unfortunately, at this time, we cannot accommodate your request. The word request was a deliberate insult. This wasn't a request. It was a sacred duty mandated by the United States Armed Forces. This is not a piece of lost luggage, Mr. Vance. This is a United States soldier, Thorne said, his voice dangerously quiet. I have escorted remains before. I know the procedure better than you do. There is no internal protocol that supersedes a Department of Defense order. So, let's stop playing games. What is the real reason you're blocking this flight? Vance's practiced composure cracked for a second. His eyes shifted, a flicker of irritation crossing his face before being smoothed over. Colonel, I don't appreciate your tone. We are a private company, and we reserve the right to enforce our policies. If you continue to cause a disturbance, I'll have to call airport security. It was a threat, cloaked in corporate jargon. They were trying to intimidate him, to make him back down. Thorne felt the eyes of the people in line on him. He could feel the judgment, the impatience, but he also felt a new resolve hardening inside him. They weren't just disrespecting him. They were desecrating the memory of Liam Miller. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, so only Vance could hear him. You do that. You call security. And when they get here, I will explain to them, and to every news camera that will listen, how Global Wings Airlines is holding a fallen American hero hostage on the tarmac. Let's see how that plays out for your company's stock price. Vance's face paled. He had underestimated the man in the uniform. He clearly wasn't used to being challenged by someone who couldn't be cowed by threats of authority. He straightened his tie, a nervous gesture. There's no need for that, he said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. He turned to Sandra, who was trying to make herself invisible behind her monitor. Let me make a call, see if we can get this sorted out. Vance walked a few feet away, turning his back to Thorne as he pulled out his phone. He kept his voice low, but Thorne's hearing, sharpened by years of listening for the snap of a twig in a silent forest, was exceptional. He couldn't catch every word, but he caught enough. Vance wasn't talking to a corporate superior. The cadence was different. It was clipped, professional, like a field report. Situation is more complicated than anticipated, Vance murmured into the phone, his hand cupped around his mouth. He listened for a moment, his posture rigid. Then, he spoke the words that turned the cold dread in Thorne's stomach to ice. Understood, Vance said, his voice barely a whisper. Yet it carried to Thorne with perfect, terrifying clarity. Package confirmed. The escort is uncooperative. Package. Escort. The world tilted. This wasn't a bureaucratic screw-up. It wasn't about disrespect or corporate policy. This was an interception. They weren't just trying to stop him. They were after Liam. Or, more accurately, something Liam had with him. Thorne's mission had just changed. This was no longer an escort. It was a recovery operation on hostile ground, and he was standing at ground zero. The words, uncooperative escort, echoed in Thorne's mind. And in that instant, the battlefield shifted. The fluorescent-lit terminal was no longer a civilian space. It was an operational theater. The bored travelers, the crying children, the flight announcements, they were all just terrain, cover, and concealment. His grief was a cold, hard stone in his gut, but his training rose like a tide to submerge it. He was no longer just a mourning brother in arms. He was an operator. And his objective was under threat. When Garrett Vance turned back around, his face a mask of false concern, he found a different man waiting for him. Thorne's posture hadn't changed, but his eyes had. They were no longer just sad. They were predatory. Any luck sorting out your internal protocol, Mr. Vance? Thorne asked, his voice deceptively calm. He deliberately pitched his voice to Carrie, drawing the attention of the now curious onlookers in the queue. Vance's composure tightened. We're working on it, Colonel. It takes time. Does it? Thorne countered, taking a half step closer. Because it sounded like you got your answer rather quickly. You confirmed the package was here. He let the word hang in the air, loaded with insinuation. And you reported that the escort was being, what was the word, uncooperative. A collective gasp rippled through the people nearby. The corporate jargon, when repeated in the open, sounded sinister. Vance's face went from pale to ashen. He had been caught. I don't know what you think you heard, Colonel. I know exactly what I heard. Thorne cut him off, his voice like chipping ice. Now, you're going to tell me who was on the other end of that phone call, and you're going to tell me why they refer to a fallen American soldier as a package. Quote, from about 20 feet back in the line, Frank Rizzo, a retired Marine Master Sergeant with a face like a road map of past bar fights and desert deployments, shifted his weight. He'd seen it all in his 30 years of service, from back alley deals in Okinawa to tense standoffs in Fallujah. He knew the look in Thorne's eyes. It was the look of a man who had just identified a threat and was calculating the kill chain. This wasn't a ticked-off officer. This was a hunter. Frank pulled his USMC hat down a little lower and began to watch. Really watch. At the same time, a young woman with bright pink streaks in her hair, standing off to the side, felt a jolt of adrenaline. Chloe Jensen wasn't an investigative journalist. She was a travel blogger whose biggest scoop to date was finding the best cannoli in Boston's North End. But she knew injustice when she saw it. The supervisor's shifty eyes, the colonel's righteous fury. This was more than just bad customer service. This was a story. She discreetly lifted her phone, tapped the icon for her streaming app, and typed a quick title. Disgrace at JFK US. Army colonel blocked from escorting fallen soldier home. She hit the little red button. She was live. Thorne ignored the growing murmurs and the subtle glow of phone screens. His focus was absolute. While his words pinned Vance to the spot, his eyes were in constant motion, scanning, assessing. He found what he was looking for. Two men. They were wearing the gray jumpsuits of the airport sanitation crew, standing near a row of vending machines. But they were all wrong. Their boots weren't the scuffed, comfortable work boots of janitors. They were black, tactical, and spotlessly clean. Their posture was rigid, their gazes constantly sweeping the area before snapping back to his confrontation with Vance. One of them had a slight bulge under his left arm that definitely wasn't a bottle of cleaning fluid. They weren't sanitation. They were operators. Low-level contractors maybe, but trained. A cold realization washed over Thorne. This elaborate charade at the counter, it wasn't the main event. It was a diversion. They were trying to stall him, to pin him down in a public spectacle. Why? His mind raced, processing the tactical situation. What was their objective? They couldn't abduct him. Not here. They couldn't make the casket disappear from the tarmac. Too much exposure. So what did they want? His eyes snapped back to Vance, then flickered toward the tarmac, where Liam's transfer case was waiting in the custody of the ground crew. The case itself was secure, but the protocol was specific. Accompanying the remains was a locked, sealed footlocker containing the deceased's personal effects. Uniforms, letters, a laptop, everything meticulously cataloged. Everything, the pieces slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. They weren't after Liam's body. They were after his belongings. They needed to create a scene, a delay, a moment of manufactured chaos just long enough for their two janitors to slip past the distracted ground crew and access that footlocker. Whatever Liam had found, whatever had gotten him killed, was in there. Mr. Vance, Thorne said, his voice dropping again, but this time it held a new chilling certainty. I'm done talking to you. He turned away from the counter, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He wasn't just looking at them anymore. He was addressing them. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Colonel Marcus Thorne. I am trying to bring a young soldier, a hero, home to his family. This airline, for reasons they refuse to explain, is preventing me from doing that. His voice, trained to command on the battlefield, cut through the terminal's din. The entire area went quiet. Phones were now being held up openly. Dozens of tiny red lights blinking in the crowd. Chloe's livestream viewer count exploded. The comments section was a torrent of outrage. "This is disgusting. Shame on Global Wings. Someone call the news." Vance was trapped. He was losing control, and he knew it. He fumbled for his radio, his hand shaking. "Security to gate B23. We have a disturbance," but it was too late. Frank Rizzo had seen enough. He stepped out of the line, his 6'3" frame, an imposing presence. He walked right up to the counter, standing shoulder to shoulder with Thorne. "Son," he said to Vance, his voice a low growl. "I spent 30 years in the Marine Corps. I've seen my share of messed up situations, but I've never, ever seen a uniformed officer escorting one of our own get treated like a criminal. You've got about 10 seconds to fix this before this disturbance gets a whole lot bigger." The two men in sanitation jumpsuits tensed. One of them subtly touched his ear, listening to a hidden comms device. They were getting new orders. The plan was failing. Thorne saw their subtle shift in posture. They were about to make a move. He had to keep them off balance. He looked directly at Vance, but his words were for the operatives he couldn't see. "It's not the flight, is it?" Thorne said, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. "It's the footlocker. Liam's personal effects. That's what you want, isn't it?" Vance's eyes went wide with genuine shock. He had no idea the colonel was that perceptive. The carefully constructed wall of lies had just been bulldozed. In the distance, the two janitors froze, their cover completely blown. They had been identified. The mission was compromised. One of them met Thorne's gaze from across the terminal floor. There was no mistaking the look in his eyes. It was the cold, flat recognition of one predator spotting another. The game had just changed. And everyone in the terminal, whether they knew it or not, was now on the board. Thorne's accusation. "It's the footlocker," hung in the air like a live grenade. Garrett Vance looked as if he'd been physically struck, his face a mess of panic and disbelief. The carefully managed situation had spiraled into a public relations catastrophe, and now, somehow, the colonel knew the real objective. Across the terminal, the two fake janitors exchanged a look. Their window of opportunity was closing fast. The crowd, already simmering, began to boil. Frank Rizzo, the old Marine, slammed a beefy hand on the counter, making both Vance and the terminal agent jump. "You heard the man," Rizzo boomed, his voice resonating with years of drillfield authority. "Are you telling me you're trying to mess with a fallen soldier's property? Is that what Global Wings does now?" Chloe Jensen, still streaming, felt her heart pounding. Her viewer count had rocketed past 50,000. The comment section was a waterfall of fury. Major news outlets were being tagged. Veterans groups were being alerted. She was no longer just a travel blogger. She was the epicenter of a national story breaking in real time. Vance, desperate to regain control, stammered, "This is absurd. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down, or what?" Thorne interrupted, his voice cutting and precise. "You'll have me arrested? Go ahead. I'm sure a jury would love to hear about the package and the footlocker." He was bluffing, but it was a calculated one. He needed to keep the pressure on, to keep the spotlight fixed on Vance and away from the two operatives. He saw one of them start to drift toward a service corridor, a potential route to the tarmac. Thorne needed an ally who understood the board. He turned his head slightly toward Rizzo, never taking his eyes off Vance. He subtly raised his left hand, as if adjusting his collar, and tapped his forefinger against his thumb, twice an old, simple signal for, "Watch my back." Rizzo's eyes, roomy but sharp, widened for a second. He hadn't seen a field sign like that in 20 years. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod. A silent pact was sealed. An Army Ranger and a Marine gunny, two strangers bound by a shared code, were now a fire team. Seeing his threats were useless, Vance switched tactics. He forced a placating, oily smile. "Look, Colonel, there has clearly been a terrible misunderstanding. A systems glitch. Please, allow me to personally apologize. We can bypass this whole line. I'll escort you to our first-class lounge. get you a drink, and we'll have you on the next flight out. Upgraded, of course. On the house. It was a classic misdirection. Separate him from the herd. Isolate the target. My respect for Private Miller isn't for sale, Mr. Vance, Thorne said loudly, ensuring the cameras caught it. And it can't be bought with a first-class ticket. The crowd erupted in a smattering of applause. Vance's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He was completely out of his depth. Thorne used the moment. He saw the second operative moving, trying to circle around the crowd toward the gate entrance. He needed to keep them pinned. He glanced at Rizzo, then subtly flicked his eyes toward a self-service baggage cart parked nearby. Rizzo understood instantly. He lumbered over to the cart, pretending to be a clumsy old man struggling with his carry-on. With a theatrical grunt, he accidentally knocked a large, steaming cup of coffee from a nearby passenger's hand. The hot liquid splashed directly onto the cart's electronic control panel. There was a shower of sparks, a loud FZZT, and a puff of acrid smoke. The automated cart seized up, its wheels locking, effectively blocking the narrowest part of the walkway the operative was trying to use. The operative stopped short, his face a mask of cold fury, as he was forced to retreat back into the crowd. The diversion gave Thorne the seconds he needed. He looked back at Chloe. She was focused, her phone steady. She was his overwatch, his eye in the sky. She had no idea how critical her role had just become. As she held the phone, her thumb brushed the screen, zooming in on the chaos. For a split second, the frame tightened on the back of the counter, where Vance had left his personal phone face up. The screen lit up with an incoming notification. Chloe's breath hitched. Her blogger's instinct for detail and her millennial's fluency with technology merged. The preview of the message was stark against the dark screen. It was from a contact labeled simply Aegis Dispatch. Subject is too high profile. Abort collection. Move to Plan B. Initiate diversionary protocol. Go ahead. Chloe's mind raced. Aegis? Diversionary protocol? This was bigger than she could have imagined. She quickly, almost invisibly, angled her phone down, tapped the screen to take a screenshot, and then brought it back up as if nothing had happened. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had to get the information to Thorne. She pretended to stumble, moving closer to the counter. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling slightly, making her seem like just another overwhelmed bystander. She moved past Rizzo and leaned toward Thorne. "Colonel," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din. "I have to show you something. On my phone." Thorne, who had been expecting a fan or a supporter, was about to brush her off when he saw the look in her eyes. It wasn't awe. It was urgent, intelligent fear. He gave a curt nod. She held her phone below the counter's edge, angled so only he could see. His eyes scanned the screenshot. Aegis Dispatch. The name hit him like a physical shock. Aegis Dynamics. The massive private military contractor. They were the ones who had supported his unit's last operation. They were the ones who had supplied the intelligence for the patrol route where Liam was killed. Plan B, initiate diversionary protocol. His blood ran cold. Plan A, the quiet theft had failed. Plan B wouldn't be quiet. A diversionary protocol meant chaos, mass confusion. In that chaos, a professional team could move with impunity. They weren't just going to steal the footlocker anymore. They were going to take it by force. And they were going to eliminate the uncooperative escort who stood in their way. He looked up from the phone, his eyes meeting Chloe's. He saw the understanding on her face. She knew. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice grim, "and keep recording, no matter what happens." The words, "initiate diversionary protocol," were a death sentence. Thorne knew what that meant in the cold calculus of black operations. It meant controlling the environment by creating maximum chaos. It meant creating a kill box before he could even process a response. A piercing, high-frequency screech split the air. Not a fire alarm, this was different. It was the shrill, insistent wail of a full-scale security alert. Red lights began to flash along the ceiling, bathing the terminal in a hellish, pulsing glow. An automated voice, devoid of emotion, blared from the PA system. Attention. This is a Level 3 security alert. All operations are suspended. All passengers, please move away from windows and gates. Await instructions from security personnel. Panic erupted. The ambient chaos of the terminal instantly transformed into a stampede of fear. People screamed, grabbed their children, and abandoned their luggage, surging away from the gates as instructed. The sudden violent flow of the crowd was a weapon in itself, creating confusion and breaking lines of sight. Airport security, caught completely off guard, were immediately overwhelmed, their frantic radio calls adding to the cacophony as they were drawn toward the main concourse, away from Thorne's position. This was Plan B. It was brutal, indiscriminate, and terrifyingly effective. "They're making their move!" Thorne yelled over the noise, grabbing Chloe's arm to keep her from being swept away. He pulled her and Rizzo behind the now abandoned check-in counter, creating a small island of relative calm in the human tidal wave. "What the hell is going on?" Rizzo shouted, his eyes scanning the chaos with a veteran's practiced gaze. "Aegis Dynamics," Thorne said, the name tasting like ash. "They're a private military contractor. They ran support for my unit overseas. They're not just trying to stop me. They're trying to retrieve something from Liam's footlocker. And they're willing to trigger a security crisis to do it." He watched the two operatives he'd spotted earlier. They were no longer trying to be covert. They moved with the fluid, predatory grace of sharks in a feeding frenzy, cutting through the panicked crowd, their objective clear. The service corridor leading to the tarmac and the baggage handling area. Thorne's mind was a whirlwind of memories. He thought of Liam, not as a soldier, but as the geeky kid who could dismantle and rebuild a server blindfolded. The kid who saw patterns no one else did. On their last night at the FOB, Liam had been unusually quiet, hunched over his ruggedized laptop. "Something's not right, Colonel," Liam had said, his face illuminated by lines of code. "There are ghosts in the machine. Phantom data, supply logs that don't add up, comms chatter that disappears. Someone's scrubbing the system, but they're sloppy. They're leaving echoes." Thorne had dismissed it as stress, a fatal mistake. Liam hadn't just seen echoes. He had found the ghosts. And he must have downloaded proof. The proof that was now in a footlocker just a few hundred yards away. It wasn't on paper. A professional like Liam would never be so clumsy. It had to be digital. Hidden. The laptop, Thorne breathed, the realization striking him. "It's on his laptop. They'll get to it before we ever can," Rizzo said grimly, watching the Aegis operatives closing in on their goal. "Not if they can't find it," Thorne countered. He had to trust his instincts, trust the memory of the brilliant kid he'd failed to protect. Liam was a master of misdirection. He wouldn't have put the data in the most obvious place. He would have hidden it in plain sight. Thorne's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it, his mind racing. He pictured Liam's personal effects as they were being packed. His uniforms, his books, a few dog-eared photos, and the watch. The clunky, outdated G-Shock watch Liam always wore. It had been a gift from his father, who had passed away when Liam was a teenager. He never took it off. It was scratched, the band frayed. It was the last thing anyone would think to look at. A piece of sentimental junk. A ghost in the machine. A perfect hiding place. The phone buzzed again, more insistently. Annoyed, Thorne pulled it out. It was a message from an unknown, encrypted number. His training screamed at him not to open it, but something compelled him. He tapped the notification. The decrypted message was short, the text stark white against a black background. "They killed him for the watch. Don't let them get it." A friend. Thorne's blood ran cold. He stared at the screen, the anonymous words confirming his desperate hope. He looked up, his eyes meeting Rizzo's. He didn't have to say a word. The old Marine saw the grim certainty on his face. "Chloe, keep that stream live," Thorne commanded, his voice now pure steel. "Rizzo, with me. We're not getting out of here. We're going on the offensive." He vaulted over the counter, the formal dress uniform suddenly feeling like a warrior's armor once more. The mission was no longer about escorting remains. It was about protecting a dead man's last testament. He had to get to that footlocker and retrieve the watch before Aegis's cleanup crew could bury Liam's truth along with his body. The terminal was their cage, But Thorne was about to remind them who the real predator was. The moment Thorne vaulted the counter, the pretense of a civil disagreement shattered. He was no longer a passenger. He was a combatant, with Rizzo at his flank and Chloe trailing behind. Her phone held steady like a weapon. They moved against the tide of fleeing civilians. The blaring alarms and flashing lights created a disorienting, hellish landscape. But for Thorne, it was just another battlefield. "They're heading for the baggage claim access door," Rizzo yelled, pointing toward a reinforced steel door marked ground crew only. The two Aegis operatives had broken away from the crowd and were sprinting toward it, their fake sanitation uniforms now an obvious liability. Thorne knew they couldn't beat them in a straight race. He needed to change the game. His eyes darted around, assessing the environment for opportunities. He saw it. A row of large, automated luggage carts, abandoned in the chaos. "Rizzo, the carts! Create a blockade," Thorne commanded. The old Marine didn't hesitate. With a roar that seemed to channel decades of pent-up aggression, he shoved one of the heavy carts with all his might. The multi-hundred-pound vehicle rolled, its momentum building, before crashing into another cart, which in turn slammed into a third. In seconds, they had created a tangled wall of steel and plastic, completely blocking the most direct path to the access door. The two operatives skidded to a halt, their route cut off. One of them snarled in frustration and pointed toward an alternate path, a longer route through the now deserted food court. They were delayed, but not stopped. Suddenly, a new figure strode into the scene, moving with an unnerving calm against the flow of panic. He was in his late 40s, dressed in a tailored $1,000 suit that screamed corporate power. His Global Wings ID identified him as Arthur Sterling, Executive Vice President, but his eyes, cold and calculating, held no trace of an airline executive's customer service smile. They held the chilling emptiness of a man who signs checks for wet work. Garrett Vance, the terminal supervisor, scurried behind him like a beaten dog. "Colonel Thorne," Sterling called out, his voice a smooth, commanding baritone that sliced through the alarm screech. He held up his hands in a gesture of peace that was utterly unconvincing. "Enough of this madness. My apologies for the incompetence of my staff. The security alert is a false alarm, a system malfunction. We'll have it shut off momentarily." It was a lie, and everyone knew it. He was trying to de-escalate, to regain control of the narrative that Chloe's live stream was blasting to the world. "Let's all just calm down," Sterling continued, his gaze flicking to Chloe's phone with clear disdain. "I will personally escort you, Colonel, through a private security channel to your aircraft. We can put this whole unfortunate incident behind us." The trap was obvious. A private security channel meant a secluded hallway, an ambush, a place with no witnesses and no cameras. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Thorne stated flatly. Sterling's facade of civility began to crack. "Colonel, you are interfering with airport operations and inciting a panic. You are leaving me with very few options." "I've got one for you," Thorne countered. He turned, making sure he was squarely in the frame of Chloe's camera, his face a grim mask of determination. He spoke with the clear, unwavering voice of an officer making a formal declaration. "My name is Colonel Marcus Thorne, United States Army Rangers. I am on a mission-critical military escort. I have reason to believe that employees of Global Wings Airlines are acting as agents for Aegis Dynamics, a private military contractor, in an attempt to illegally seize classified materials from the personal effects of a deceased American soldier. I believe my life and the security of this evidence are in imminent danger. I am formally requesting the immediate intervention of the military police and federal authorities at this location." The effect was instantaneous and profound. He hadn't just made an accusation. He had invoked the full weight of the U.S. military on a live, viral feed. Chloe's viewer count surged past 500,000. The words Aegis Dynamics and military police flooded the comment section. She had just captured a declaration of war. Sterling's face turned to stone. The colonel had checkmated him in public. The subtlety of the operation was destroyed. But as Thorne watched him, he saw Sterling's hand slip into his suit jacket. He wasn't reaching for a phone. He was making a call of a different kind. A new group of uniformed personnel appeared, moving with purpose through the thinning crowd. They weren't the bumbling airport cops from before. These were Port Authority police, better armed and better trained. But they weren't moving towards Sterling. They were forming a loose cordon, their movements deliberately cutting Thorne, Rizzo, and Chloe off from any escape route. They were closing the box. Sterling's lips curled into a semblance of a smile. It was a terrifying sight. "You've made a grave error, Colonel," he said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. He pulled out his phone and made a short call to his operatives, his eyes never leaving Thorne's. "Sterling here," he said into the phone. "The asset is compromised. The target has gone public. Sanctioning aggressive containment. I want him neutralized. Now." And a Port Authority captain, a thick-set man with a hard face, stepped forward, his hand on his holstered sidearm. He was responding to Vance's earlier disturbance call, now amplified by the chaos of the security alert. "Colonel Thorne," the captain said, his voice flat and official, unaware he was a pawn. "I am responding to a report of a public disturbance and terroristic threats. You need to come with me. Now." Rizzo let out a disbelieving curse, instinctively moving to put himself between the officer and Thorne. Chloe gasped, but her hands, shaking, kept the camera steady. This was Sterling's new play. Use the legitimate authorities as an unwitting shield. While Thorne was tied up with the police, Sterling's own team would have a clear path to the footlocker. It was a brilliant, cynical move. The click of the Port Authority captain's holster was a definitive, chilling sound that cut through the now fading alarm. The terminal, once a sea of chaos, had become an arena. The few remaining travelers and airport staff watched from a distance, paralyzed. Their faces a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. Thorne stood his ground, his mind racing through tactical options, each one ending in a hail of gunfire and failure. He was trapped. "Don't make this difficult, Colonel," the captain repeated, his voice harder. Rizzo shifted his weight, his old instinct screaming at him to charge, to go down fighting. Thorne subtly put a hand on his arm, a silent command to hold. A suicidal charge would only get them killed faster. Sterling watched with a look of smug satisfaction. His problem was about to be solved, and it would all be recorded as a justifiable police action against a deranged, threatening soldier. The perfect cover-up, but then, a new sound emerged from the main concourse. It was the measured, rhythmic cadence of disciplined boots on linoleum. A group of 4 people in plainclothes, 3 men and a woman strode into the terminal. They moved with an economy of motion that screamed federal law enforcement or military. They weren't armed visibly, but they radiated an aura of lethal competence that made the armed Port Authority cops look like amateurs. They parted the remaining onlookers like a ship's bow through water, their eyes locked on the standoff. The woman was in the lead. She was in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a posture that was as rigid as Thorne's. She wore a simple black pantsuit, but she moved like she was wearing body armor and carrying a rifle. She didn't slow down until she was standing directly between Thorne and the police captain, placing herself in the line of fire. "Stand down, Captain," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable current of absolute authority. The captain, startled by her sudden appearance, bristled. "This is a Port Authority police matter, ma'am. This man is under investigation. Identify yourself." The woman reached into her jacket and pulled out a leather credential case. She flipped it open. "Major Evelyn Reed, United States Army, Criminal Investigation Command. Colonel Thorne and this entire area are now under the jurisdiction of the U.S. military. Your authority here is terminated. Tell your men to stand down. Now." The words Criminal Investigation Command hit the captain like a physical blow. He stared at the credentials, his face turning pale. He was a local cop who had just tried to draw down on a full-bird Army colonel on the orders of a civilian. He had been played for a fool. He mumbled a command into his radio, and around the circle, the Port Authority officers reluctantly eased their stances. Sterling's face, which had been a mask of triumph, contorted into a snarl of disbelief and fury. "Major, this man is a threat. The only threat I see here, Mr. Sterling." Reed cut him off. Her gaze like ice chips. Is a corporate executive from a known government contractor giving unlawful orders and triggering a false security crisis. And she turned her head slightly toward Thorne. and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something other than steel in her eyes. It was a hint of grim validation. "We received your message, Colonel," she said, her voice low enough for only him to hear. She was the friend. "PFC Miller contacted our whistleblower hotline 72 hours before his last patrol. He told us he was uploading a data package to a secure server, but the transmission was cut off midstream. We've been trying to find what he had ever since. Your public broadcast," she glanced at Chloe's still recording phone, "gave us the exigent circumstances we needed to intervene overtly." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Liam hadn't just found evidence. He had tried to deliver it. And when Aegis realized it, they killed him. Reed's attention snapped back to the scene. Her team had fanned out, subtly but effectively surrounding Sterling, Vance, and the now confused Port Authority captain. They weren't holding guns, but their positioning was a clear and present threat. "Mr. Sterling, Mr. Vance," Reed said, her voice now formal and cold. "On behalf of the Department of Defense, you are both being detained for questioning in connection with a federal investigation into conspiracy, espionage, and the potential murder of a United States Army soldier." And two of Reed's agents stepped forward, producing handcuffs. Sterling looked utterly dumbfounded. "You can't do this. I have lawyers. I have connections." "Save it," Reed said flatly. As one of her agents cuffed Vance, the terminal supervisor, completely broken, looked at Thorne with wild, terrified eyes. "You have no idea what you've done," Vance shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You don't know who you're messing with. Aegis doesn't forget. Aegis will bury you all." It was the desperate cry of a small man who had played with monsters and lost, but it was the name that mattered. He had confirmed it. On a live stream that now had over 1 million concurrent viewers, the link between the airline, the contractors, and the threat to a U.S. colonel was explicitly stated by one of the conspirators. Major Reed nodded to her agent. "Get them out of here." As Sterling was led away, his face a thunderous mask of rage. He locked eyes with Thorne. He said nothing, but his expression was a silent, venomous promise of retribution. The cavalry had arrived, but Thorne knew this battle was far from over. He had won the skirmish at the airport. The war against Aegis Dynamics, however, had just begun. The chaos of the terminal faded away, replaced by the sterile, soundproofed quiet of a military operations room. Major Reed had commandeered a secure facility at the nearby Fort Hamilton, a small army post overlooking the New York harbor. The room was a stark cube of gray walls, humming servers, and glowing screens, a world away from the public drama that had unfolded at JFK. On a steel table in the center of the room sat the object of the entire conflict, the footlocker, containing Liam Miller's personal effects. Thorne, Rizzo, and a visibly shaken Chloe were present, along with Reed and a single tight-lipped CID forensics technician. The air was thick with anticipation. The transfer case is being moved under armed guard to a secure mortuary. "Liam is safe," Reed said to Thorne, her tone softening for the first time. "Now let's see what he died for." The technician, using specialized tools, carefully broke the official military seal on the footlocker. He opened the lid. Inside, neatly folded, were Liam's dress blues, his PT gear, a few books, and a small leather-bound journal. The technician, wearing white gloves, carefully lifted each item, placing it on a sterile cloth. Finally, at the bottom, was the watch. The G-Shock was exactly as Thorne remembered it, bulky, black, and well-worn. It looked like a cheap, disposable piece of plastic, utterly insignificant. The technician handed it to Thorne. Holding it, Thorne felt a profound connection to the young soldier. This small object was Liam's last will and testament, his final act of defiance. "He told me once," Thorne said, his voice thick with emotion, "that the password to all his important stuff was the birthday of the greatest soldier who ever lived." Reed raised an eyebrow. "General Patton?" Thorne shook his head, a sad smile touching his lips. "Number Liam was a geek." He meant Captain America. He looked at the small buttons on the side of the watch. He didn't know the model, but he knew the date. He carefully pressed the buttons in sequence. 0 to 7, 0 to 4, 1 to 9, -1, -8. the 4th of July, 1918. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the watch's digital screen, which had been displaying the time, flickered. The numbers dissolved and were replaced by a single line of text. Data drive unlocked. A tiny, almost invisible seam on the side of the watch popped open, revealing a micro SD card slot. The forensics tech carefully extracted the card and slid it into a secure reader connected to a large monitor. A file directory appeared. It was meticulously organized, with folders labeled Transactions, Ghost Patrols, Coms, and Personnel. He clicked on Transactions. The screen filled with encrypted shipping manifests and offshore bank statements. It was a clear, damning trail of U.S. military-grade weaponry, from rifles and night vision goggles to advanced drone jammers being diverted from Army supply depots, marked as lost in transit or destroyed, and then sold through a series of shell corporations to a buyer in the Middle East. Every transaction was linked back to Aegis Dynamics. Next, Ghost Patrols. This folder contained patrol routes, threat assessments, and after-action reports. Liam had highlighted specific patrols, including his last one. Alongside the official reports, he had embedded fragments of intercepted radio chatter from local insurgents. The chatter proved the insurgents knew the patrol routes hours in advance. They weren't ambushes. They were scheduled appointments for an execution. Aegis was creating conflicts and selling weapons to both sides, profiting from the blood of American soldiers. My God, Rizzo breathed, his face ashen. They were farming us. The final folder was labeled for Colonel Thorne. The tech clicked on it, and a single video file appeared. He hit play. Liam's face filled the screen. He was in his small room at the FOB, the camera on his laptop filming him. He looked tired, scared, but resolute. "Colonel," he began, his voice strained, "if you're seeing this, it means I didn't make it, and it means Aegis is coming for this evidence. Don't trust anyone. They have people everywhere." He took a shaky breath. "They're selling us out, sir. All of us. I trace the money, the weapons. It goes all the way to the top. To their CEO, Alistair Finch. He's been orchestrating this for years. They're not just contractors. They're a shadow army playing by their own rules." His eyes looked directly into the camera, as if he were looking right at Thorne. "I know they'll come for me, but I'm not scared. What they're doing, it's a cancer. It has to be cut out. Please, sir, finish this. Tell my parents. Tell them I was a good soldier. Tell them I completed my mission." The video ended. The room was silent, the weight of Liam's final words pressing down on them all. Chloe was openly crying, her hand over her mouth. Thorne stood like a man carved from stone, his heart a cold, heavy knot of grief and rage. Suddenly, Major Reed's secure phone buzzed. She answered it, her face grim. Reed. She listened, her expression hardening with every second. "What's the source?" "Confirmed?" "Understood." And she hung up, her eyes finding Thorne's. The look in them was terrifying. "That was my field office in D.C., she said, her voice tight and urgent. "They just intercepted a high-priority communication from a known Aegis server. It was a single-word command sent to a wet-work team already on U.S. soil." She paused, taking a deep breath. The command was Skork. "Intel suggests it's their protocol for total evidence and witness sterilization. The target isn't us, Colonel. Not yet." Her eyes bored into his. "The target is a farmhouse in rural Virginia. They're going after Liam's family." The word scorch obliterated the sterile quiet of the operations room. For Thorne, the mission became primal, absolute. His promise to Carol Miller, "Bring my boy home," now meant more than delivering a casket. It meant protecting the family Liam had died to save. "Get me a flight." Thorne's voice was a low growl, devoid of any protocol. "Now." "Oh, already on it," Reed snapped, already speaking into her comms unit. "I need an immediate evac transport, Fort Hamilton to rural Virginia. Designation. This is a code red, active threat to civilian life. Authorized use of armed aerial assets." I want a Blackhawk on the pad in 5 minutes. There was no time for commercial flights, no time for convoys. This was a race against a kill team. As Reed coordinated logistics, Thorne turned to Rizzo and Chloe. You've done more than enough. You're both civilians. You need to stay here where it's safe. Rizzo, the old Marine, shook his head, a stubborn fire in his eyes. The hell I will. I'm not sitting on the sidelines while those bastards go after a Gold Star family. I'm with you, Colonel. Chloe, wiping tears from her face, held up her phone. The live stream had ended, but she was still recording. The world needs to see how this ends, she said, her voice shaking but firm. They don't get to do this in the dark. Not anymore. And Thorne looked at them, the grizzled veteran, and the young blogger. An unlikely fire team forged in the crucible of a terminal standoff. He gave a single sharp nod. Stay behind me. 4 minutes later, the thumping whump 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 of rotor blades echoed across the army post. A sleek, black UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter. The kind usually reserved for special operations. Touched down on the pad. Thorne, Reed, Rizzo, Chloe, and a small team of heavily armed SID agents piled in. As the helicopter lifted off, banking hard over the waters of the harbor and turning south, Thorne could see the glittering lights of New York City spread out below him, oblivious to the life-or-death race unfolding in the night sky. The flight was a tense 90-minute sprint. Reed, headset on, received constant updates. The Aegis Team 4 men in an unmarked van was closing in on the Miller family's farmhouse. Local law enforcement, alerted by a credible threat report from the FBI, was en route, but they were still 10 minutes out. The Aegis team was only 2 minutes away. They wouldn't make it in time. Pilot, put us down in the field west of the house, Thorne ordered, leaning into the cockpit. As close as you can get. We're going in hot. The Black Hawk descended rapidly, its landing lights off. It touched down in a dark, empty pasture a quarter mile from the farmhouse. The SID team fanned out, creating a perimeter. Thorne, his service pistol now drawn, led the way, moving through the tall grass with a speed and silence that belied his dress uniform. They saw the headlights of the unmarked van as it turned onto the long gravel driveway leading to the house. The vehicle stopped just out of sight of the front porch. 4 dark figures emerged, armed with suppressed carbines. They began to move toward the house in a classic diamond formation, their movements fluid and professional. They were here to execute a family in their sleep. SID team on my signal, Reed whispered into her comms. Light them up. Thorne watched the Aegis team creep onto the porch. One of them produced a tool to bypass the lock on the front door. At that moment, the porch light flicked on. Liam's father, a stoic man with a weathered face, stood in the doorway, holding a double-barreled shotgun. He must have heard the van. Can I help you, gentlemen? He asked, his voice steady. The lead Aegis operative didn't hesitate. He raised his carbine. Now, Reed commanded. The night exploded. High-intensity floodlights from the SID team's position turned the front yard into day. Federal agents, drop your weapons! Reed's voice boomed through a megaphone. The Aegis team, caught completely by surprise, reacted on instinct. 2 of them spun around, firing blindly into the darkness. But they were outmaneuvered and outgunned. The CID team's response was a volley of precise, controlled shots. The firefight was brutal and over in less than 10 seconds. When the echoes of the gunfire faded, the 4 Aegis operatives lay still on the lawn. Thorne rushed onto the porch as Carol Miller came running out, her face a mask of terror. He holstered his weapon and stood before them, his uniform now covered in dust and grass stains. Mr. and Mrs. Miller, he said, his voice catching in his throat. I'm Colonel Thorne. I promised I'd bring him home. Epilogue. 3 weeks later. The Aegis Dynamics scandal became one of the biggest stories of the decade. Fueled by Chloe Jensen's explosive, award-winning live stream and the irrefutable evidence on Liam's watch, the Department of Justice launched a full-scale investigation. Alistair Finch was arrested by U.S. Marshals while trying to flee the country on his private jet. Dozens of corrupt politicians and military officers were indicted. Global Wings Airlines, gutted by lawsuits and a nationwide boycott, filed for bankruptcy. On a crisp, clear autumn morning, Colonel Marcus Thorne stood before a simple white headstone in Arlington National Cemetery. Liam M. Miller, PFC, U.S. Army, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Major Reed, now a lieutenant colonel, came and stood beside him. "The last of the indictments came down this morning," she said quietly. "We got them all, thanks to him." Thorne nodded, his eyes fixed on the name carved into the marble. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his personal challenge coin, the insignia of his ranger unit, gleaming in the sun. He pressed it firmly into the soft grass at the base of the headstone. "A soldier's final sign of respect. Mission complete, kid," he whispered, his voice thick. "Rest easy." He turned and walked away, his shoulders squared, leaving the coin as a silent sentinel. The sun was rising higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the endless rows of graves. It was a new dawn, one that a young soldier had given his life to secure, and it was a dawn that was finally at peace.